Our gospel reading for this morning comes from the 10th chapter of that gospel, of Mark's gospel. The days of Holy Week are almost at hand. Jerusalem is just around the corner when these events take place. Listen for what the Spirit may speak to us through these words today. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to Jesus and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What is it you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with?" They replied, "We are able." Then Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." When the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you must be a slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Our gospel reading for this morning would probably benefit from a bit of context. This story takes place very shortly after Jesus has encountered a rich man who works very hard to keep the commandment, yet feels there may be something more. But Jesus' call to sell what he has and give the money to the poor and then become a disciple is too much for him. And then Jesus and his disciples hit the road again, headed towards Jerusalem. The disciples do not always come off very well in Mark's gospel. They continually misunderstand what Jesus is trying to teach them. But that's not to say they are total idiots. They have started to realize the danger that lies ahead. Mark's gospel says that as they follow Jesus, that they were amazed, and that those who were following him were afraid. And to these amazed, frightened followers, Jesus explains for a third and final time what is about to happen to him. Then James and John come to see him. Their request seems to be the epitome of the disciples' cluelessness. Along with Peter, James and John form a kind of inner circle for Jesus. They've witnessed things that the others have not seen, and now they seek to turn this closeness to their advantage. They appear to recognize that their request is a bit unseemly, but they make it just the same. But perhaps these two are not simply being arrogant or simply trying to turn their insider status into special favors. Perhaps these are just two terrified followers looking for a way to save their own skin. They've started to get that it's not going to go well in Jerusalem. Jesus is not going to overthrow the Romans. In fact, Jesus keeps talking about people killing him. In some ways, it's amazing that the disciples keep following Jesus as he leads them towards Jerusalem and a cross. Maybe these disciples have been with Jesus so long they decide to stick it out to the bitter end. Maybe because he keeps talking about rising again, they have some hope that there's something on the other side of the danger that awaits. If there really is something after Jerusalem, maybe they can be a part of it. Jesus, grant that we may sit at your right hand and at your left when you come into your glory. If you're anything like me, you do some of the things you most regret when you are afraid. People will do things they wouldn't do otherwise when they're frightened. That's why politicians on the right and the left work hard to get you to be afraid of something or someone, to be afraid of the media, the 1%, gays, Muslims, immigrants, liberals, conservatives, religious folks, secular folks. Sometimes becoming afraid of others is a way to unify people, to have people come together against a common enemy, a common other we can hate, but even then there are often regrets. Consider what this country did to Japanese Americans during World War II. Or think about more recently our willingness to spy on fellow citizens or torture people to keep us safe. Being afraid also makes it difficult to really live the Christian life. It is hard to love your neighbors when some of those neighbors are the ones we fear. And then there's that whole loving your enemy thing. I think that you can see fear at work when the 10 disciples find out about James and John's request. They get angry. What do you mean trying to get in front of us? What's going to happen to us? What about us? And if Jesus hadn't stepped in, you wonder how far this argument might have gone. I mean, would the disciples have duked it out to see who got to be first and who had to go last? But Jesus does step in, ever the teacher, ever the mentor, seeking to help disciples, to help us get it. Jesus knows that we are still caught up in the ways of the world, ways where those with power and wealth get their way, where power and wealth are something to use to gain an advantage, to get ahead. But Jesus has entirely different ideas about power and about greatness. Slave and servant are the images Jesus used to describe greatness. Embracing such a model is not a recipe for success. Donald Trump attracts the crowds that he does in large part because he is the antithesis of this. And in a time when some people are worried and afraid, such bluster has an appeal. Donald Trump may be over the top in his non-Jesus-like model of greatness, but this is largely a matter of degrees. Rare is the politician or the CEO or the power broker who thinks of himself as a slave, who puts the needs of everyone else ahead of her own. When James and John come to see Jesus, they are not thinking like slaves or servants either. And Jesus tells them they don't know what they're asking. They still understand being at Jesus' side to be about privilege and prestige. But in just days, those at Jesus' left hand and right will be two criminals on their own crosses. Not at all what James and John have in mind. But it is not so among you. That's what Jesus says after he has described the world's way of power and greatness. The disciples and the church are to model something different, a new way, the costly way of service, the way of the cross. Karl Barth, the great 20th century theologian, put it this way: the church exists to set up in the world a new sign which is radically dissimilar to the world's own manner, and which contradicts it in a way that is full of promise. Radically dissimilar to the world. Not so among you. However you phrase it, Jesus clearly expects the church, his followers, to live in a manner at odds with that of the world, askew from it in some way. And that is something that happens when this congregation opens its doors and invites those who are hungry to come and share a meal with us. That just doesn't happen in a lot of places or organizations or institutions. It also happens when we do Christian stewardship, at least when we do it more or less right. Now, asking for charitable contributions is hardly anything unique to Christian congregations. I get solicitations for charitable contributions all the time, and I suspect most of you do as well. Groups that fight disease or seek to bring clean water to communities or help abused animals often appeal to our compassion. Nonprofits like NPR or PBS may appeal to our sense of fairness, asking us to support those programs that we so enjoy. Churches sometimes use both methods. Nothing wrong with that. But that's not what I mean by stewardship. Christian stewardship reorients a person's finances and time and energy in a radically dissimilar to the world, not so among you manner that Jesus teaches his followers. Christian stewardship is where our lives reflect the way of Jesus, who comes not to be served but to serve, to offer himself. And this is not a calculation, it's not an insurance policy. It's a radical new way of living that points the world to a better day. Now, I don't know for certain if the Stewardship Committee was thinking along these lines when they came up with this year's theme, Giving from the Heart. But it certainly fits. Our hearts and the things that we love have a great influence on how we use our finances and our time and our energy. Think about the way that people make great efforts and sacrifices for the one they fall in love with, for their children, for their careers, when their hearts are devoted to those things. And Jesus is clear about his heart's devotion. It is to God and it is to neighbor. Jesus can give as he does, give even his very life because of the depth of his devotion and love. And he calls his followers, he calls his church to discover his sort of greatness where transformed hearts turn us into servants for the sake of God's new day. Imagine the possibilities if enough hearts got caught up in the same passion and devotion that captured Jesus' heart. Imagine the differences we might make and the message we might send if we were more devoted to God and to neighbor, to being Christ in and for the world. Imagine lives not motivated by fear or worry or anxiety, but by God's grace and love in Christ Jesus that fills us to overflowing and then overflows in service and love to the world. Imagine. All praise and glory to the one whose love comes to us in Christ Jesus and who gives himself for us. Thanks be to God.